Pokemon games are amazing, usually, and they tend to be among some of the highest selling games in their respective consoles. This paired with the fact that each generation of Pokemon has shown some huge improvements and changes to the formula, especially in the earlier generations, means they're bound to re-release or remake these games sometime in the future. Today, we're going to be talking about remake Pokemon games, what they meant for the series, and how they've changed over the years for being a legitimate reason to modernize older games to whatever you want to call these games. Remake Pokemon games tend to be the most beloved in the franchise, along with the third versions or enhanced versions. This does get a bit confusing, as Pokemon Crystal, for example, is essentially a re-release of Pokemon Gold and Silver, and is kind of a remake, but not really. I mean, it released after Gold and Silver. Look, Pokemon is just weird and releases the same game like 4 times, so I'll end this intro and stop rambling about this for now so I can start rambling about the first remake game in the Pokemon series in Pokemon FireRed and Pokemon LeafGreen. I have talked about Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen and the Generation 3 ecosystem of Pokemon a lot in the past. My most viewed video on this channel is on FireRed and LeafGreen. I uploaded 2 videos back to back a few months ago just focusing on FireRed and LeafGreen, and yeah, if you couldn't tell, I am somewhat of a Gen 3er, if that's a term, even though FireRed and LeafGreen is Generation 1 and Gen 3 at the same time. Pokemon's confusing. But looking back at Pokemon Red and Blue, yes, we fault them a lot for their mistakes, glitches, and weird oversights and how they aged the worst out of any Pokemon game. They were still the first in the series that spawned Pokemon to what it is today, and let me talk about it non-stop on this channel for the last few years. But back on topic, compare Red and Blue to FireRed and LeafGreen and there's a lot of noticeable differences. While the core is the same, you encounter the same Pokemon and have the same formula, the battles are the same, and the trainers follow mostly the exact same story, there's a lot of upgrades that make FireRed and LeafGreen feel completely different from the original Red and Blue game, and also they clear up the story a little bit, especially with the Team Rocket and the Sevii Island story to give us an idea on where Team Rocket was in the 2-year gap between the events of Red and Blue and the events of Gold and Silver. The Sevii Islands added a much needed post-game to the Kanto region, which was absent in Red and Blue, unless you just count catching Mewtwo and completing the Dex as the post-game in the originals. Gold and Silver set the precedent for post-games, including the entire Kanto region in with a much shorter story and amazing final battle, unlike anything we've seen in any other Pokemon game. While the Sevii Islands aren't as expansive as Kanto was in Gold and Silver, FireRed and LeafGreen even incorporated the Braille puzzles like in Ruby and Sapphire in the Sevii Islands, although they make even less sense here, as Braille in a video game makes no sense. How am I supposed to read Braille on a flat touchscreen, Nintendo? It's been 20 years and I'm still gonna complain about it. And a lot of the events like the Deoxys event or the Lugia and Ho-Oh event tie into the Hoenn region-based games as well, making all of the games feel connected in the Generation 3 ecosystem. Aside from some story clarity and post-game, many mechanics were upgraded too for FireRed and LeafGreen. Since Pokemon Red and Blue, we saw the addition of breeding, Eevees, Ivies, shiny Pokemon, and abilities and natures, which all have a big impact on how you would play FireRed and LeafGreen today versus the original Pokemon Red and Blue games, or Red and Green games if you want to be technical and you're from Japan. I would say that FireRed and LeafGreen were the most necessary remakes ever released, as 1, it was Generation 1, and Gen 1 practically prints money for Pokemon. I mean, just look at Charizard, Pikachu, or Eevee cards in TCG. They tend to be the most sought after cards by a mile, and 2, because of the upgraded mechanics. As we progress through the generations of Pokemon though, you'll notice that the upgraded mechanics are less of a reason for a game to be remade, as what they did with the next remake game, HeartGold and SoulSilver, was a bit different than what they did with the previous games in FireRed and LeafGreen. Much like Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen, HeartGold and SoulSilver were also a graphical improvement from the games they were based off of, in this case Gold and Silver, while also updating the music and modernizing Generation 2. Much like Generation 1, Generation 2 also was missing some mechanics that were introduced in later generations, especially in Generation 3, like the revamped stat system and abilities. These were all needed upgrades to modernize the Johto experience, but seeing as Generation 2 didn't need to be updated nearly as much as Red and Blue did, they added a lot of fun extra bits to make HeartGold and SoulSilver feel more like a love letter to Pokemon fans, as cliche as that may sound. First, HeartGold and SoulSilver incorporate some of the changes that their original's third version, Pokemon Crystal, had. FireRed and LeafGreen didn't do this with the changes added in their third version, Yellow version, But with HeartGold and SoulSilver, we see Ucine, a character that was only in Crystal version and not in Gold and Silver, making HeartGold and SoulSilver more like a remake of all the Generation 2 Pokemon games and not just a remake of the original paired games, Gold and Silver. They fleshed out Team Rocket a bit more and made Archer an actual character rather than a regular admin, as in FireRed and LeafGreen, Archer does appear, but you don't know it's Archer until after HeartGold and SoulSilver come out, which is kinda weird. As for the gameplay mechanics, the big one here is abilities and natures, which weren't present in Generation 2. This does change a whole lot, while the other big gameplay change was the physical and special split introduced with Generation 4. Now each move is listed as either physical or special, rather than each move of a certain type only being one or the other like it was in the past. So now Hitmonchan can use its signature elemental punches much more effectively, as they are now physical moves and not special moves. And again, while these upgrades were needed, they weren't as needed as they were with FireRed and LeafGreen, so not only did they add some of the crystal changes and also the new mechanics since Generation 2, they added a lot of other small fun elements too. The most noticeable is follow Pokemon. This doesn't really do anything in terms of core gameplay, but a lot of fans love seeing their favorite Pokemon follow them around, and if that Pokemon happens to be shiny, you'll even see the shiny variation when it's following you. It was a nice feature that made you feel more attached to your Pokemon and your team that we haven't seen implemented as well as HeartGold and SoulSilver did ever since. They also added the beloved Battle Frontier from Platinum to HeartGold and SoulSilver. This was a nice upgrade over the Battle Tower from Crystal and even just the Battle Tower from FireRed and LeafGreen. While this Battle Frontier isn't as loved as the Battle Frontier from Emerald version, it's still something more to do in the post-game on top of the already expansive post-game Johto has to offer, letting you traverse through the entire Kanto region and then battle Red. It was a shame that they didn't fix some of the issues Generation 2 originally had though. I know it's a common trope on YouTube lately to talk about the glaring level gaps in the middle part of the Johto-based games and how Price really should be a higher level gym leader or perhaps be before Jasmine. I will never not complain about a lot of things, and one of those things is why Houndour, a Generation 2 Pokemon, cannot be found in the Johto region. Just like in Gold and Silver, you can only find Houndour on Route 7, which is in Kanto. Why is this Pokemon even in the Johto Dex then? It technically is a Kanto Pokemon since it's only found there, or maybe it migrated there between the events of Red and Blue and Gold and Silver, which is why Houndour wasn't in Red and Blue. Either way, despite how good HeartGold and SoulSilver are and how loved they are among Pokemon fans for keeping the same charm Generation 2 had, while also adding all of the goodness that came with Generation 4 and everything in between, I do think it could have done a better job updating the region and the experience a little bit more. I am nitpicking a little bit here since HeartGold and SoulSilver are still fantastic games, but you know, I'm a YouTuber, what do you expect? It would be about another 4 years before the next remake games were released though in Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire for the 3DS, which did just that. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are some of the most unique remake games I've ever played, which includes Pokemon remake games and other game remakes. If we were to compare the gameplay experience from Ruby and Sapphire to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the only big key mechanic upgrade from Generation 3 to Generation 6 was the physical and special split, as well as the introduction of the fairy type, if that counts. FireRed and LeafGreen also had to deal with new types in Dark and Steel introduced in Generation 2, which I probably should have mentioned in the section about FireRed and LeafGreen, but whatever. I do see the addition of new types as a big deal, but not as big of a deal as core mechanic changes like abilities, natures, and the physical and special split, with the latter being the focus for Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire. Because the lack of needing to upgrade Ruby and Sapphire's mechanics, like say Red and Blue desperately needed or Gold and Silver needed in the past, they did something completely different with Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire to make them stand out from the other two remake games. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire follow the same general formula as Ruby and Sapphire. You collect your 8 gym badges, fight against Team Aqua or Team Magma along the way, and fight the Elite Four and the Champion Sneven. Unfortunately, unlike with HeartGold and SoulSilver, we don't see a lot of the elements from the third version, in this case Emerald version, come back in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire. For starters, in Emerald version, Team Aqua and Team Magma were both evil, and you would face both of them throughout the story, with even a new Team Magma base being added to the Emerald version. But instead, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire follow how it was in Ruby and Sapphire, with one of the two evil teams being the main evil one, depending on which version you are playing, and the other team just kind of being there with you, interacting sometimes. Team Aqua and Team Magma made way more sense in Emerald version, and the gym leaders are also the same as they were in Ruby and Sapphire and not upgraded like they were in Emerald version. The most notable gym leader with this is Watson, who in the original Ruby and Sapphire games has no Generation 3 Pokemon. Then in Emerald version, he has a Manectric as his ace, which fits really well considering it's an electric-type Pokemon introduced in the Generation 3 games that's also found near Watson's gym. They also didn't add the Hoenn Battle Frontier from Emerald version in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and instead tease us by saying it's coming soon, only for it to never come. Now, Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire are in this weird circle where yes, they are Gen 3 remakes, however they take place in a different timeline from Generation 3. So I guess the lore reason is that Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire is in a different timeline where they just never made the Battle Frontier, which could make sense, but also, I just wanted a Battle Frontier in ORAS. It was cool. We also see Wallace returning as the Sootopolis City gym leader instead of being a champion like he was in Emerald version, which to be honest, I prefer anyway, and I think most Pokemon fans would agree that they prefer Steven as the Hoenn champion other than this weird water guy. While it was disappointing not seeing the Emerald changes after coming off of HeartGold and SoulSilver, which had a lot of the Crystal changes, Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire changed a whole lot, more than any other previous remake Pokemon games. Like I've said in the past, Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire is more of a reimagining of Ruby and Sapphire rather than a remake. While it does follow the same general formula, they tie the game in with their Generation 6 counterparts, Pokemon X and Y, a lot by incorporating Mega Evolution into the main story and even adding new Mega Pokemon to the game. They basically added new Pokemon in the middle of the generation, which we haven't seen before, unless you count things like the Rotom forms or the Kyurem forms in Black and White 2, which I guess kind of count, but Mega Pokemon are just cooler. Sorry, Big Dragon Guy and Microwave Washing Machine hybrid thing. Because of the addition of Mega Pokemon, they had to change the story around as well. You're given a Latios or Latias with its corresponding Megastone before even getting the 6th Gym Badge by Steven. Your starter can Mega Evolve, and the cover legendary Pokemon have Primal forms, which are basically the same as Mega Evolution but have a cooler name, and Rayquaza even gets a Mega Evolution that's so strong it doesn't even need to hold a Megastone to Mega Evolve, making it quite overpowered. With this game tying in so much with X and Y, we also see the EXP share working for all Pokemon on your team, and an overall lower difficulty, which has been a trend in Pokemon ever since the release of X and Y in 2013. This isn't the worst thing though, and I know I'm really focusing on the negatives of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, but due to the lack of needed mechanic upgrades, I really appreciate how they just went about this remake game this time. Each previous remake Pokemon game built up on their foundation as well as their previous remake games, giving players a reason to play the remakes rather than the originals. Then Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire capitalizes on that by being a very different experience from the games they're based off of. Contests get more of a focus with Lycia now, a new character just for contest. There's a cosplay Pikachu and even a contest outfit, although it is strange that character customization wasn't featured in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire after being implemented with X and Y. It would have fit in so well with Hoenn and the contest especially, and it's a shame it didn't appear again. They did, however, do a good job of letting you catch Pokemon introduced after Generation 3 in the post-game, and with the Dex Nav, a nice tool to find rare Pokemon or to shiny hunt. I should also note that the original Ruby and Sapphire games have a 1 in 8192 odds for a shiny Pokemon appearing, which was changed in Generation 6 to be 1 in 4096, with Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire also following that same formula. This makes shiny Pokemon 2 times more common, which is a good thing for some people, but some people still prefer the good old full odds 8192 shinies you could find in the older Pokemon games. I do still really like how unique Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire feels to Ruby, Sapphire, and even Emerald, but I do think they would have benefited from having more of the Emerald changes. And if you want to hear me talk more about Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire in general, there's a video I uploaded a few months ago about the 10th anniversary of this game. We're going to take a quick detour now and talk about some re-releases and not remakes. I know it's confusing, but after the release of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, they released Generation 1 and then later on the Generation 2 Pokemon games on the Virtual Console for the 3DS. This was mainly due to accessibility, as by this point it was pretty hard to play through the Kanto region in 2016. It was also for the 20th anniversary of Pokemon, and I guess since they were porting over the Gen 1 games, they figured, why not port over the Gen 2 games as well? All of these games don't really change much from the originals, aside from small things like some move animations having less flashing or shaking, and fixing a certain sprite for some certain reasons. They did, however, allow connectivity with Pokemon Home, or Pokemon Bank at the time, so you could technically transfer over Pokemon from a true Generation 1 or Generation 2 game into a modern game if you really wanted to, which you couldn't do previously. They also added the Celebi event to Crystal version, so you can now get Celebi in that game. There was unfortunately no online trading or online battling, but as a release that cost only $9.99 on the 3DS as a downloadable title, it was a great pickup for any Pokemon fan. I feel like these releases don't get talked about nearly as much as they should, probably because the 3DS servers are shut down, so you can't get these games anymore, and you can't even get them on the Switch online, which would just be too perfect, but that's another topic for another day. And speaking of the Nintendo Switch and the Generation 1 Pokemon games, we have Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee on the Nintendo Switch released in 2018. These are remakes of Red and Blue, again, Kanto's so nice they remade it twice, and interestingly, they were also the first mainline Pokemon games released on the Switch. In the past, remake games were paired with the other game in their generation, with that other game being the starting point for that generation on that console like Ruby and Sapphire was for the Game Boy Advance. But this time they started off a new console in the Switch with a remake Pokemon game. The game follows mostly the same formula as Red and Blue, with you picking your starter Pokemon, battling the same 8 gym leaders as Red and Blue, and the same Elite Four members with a different champion. Sort of. It's your rival, but it's a different rival. Okay, this is where things get weird. So in the Let's Go games, you have the same events as Red and Blue, but with a different protagonist and a different rival, while Red and Blue, or Green, whatever your name is, still appear in the story. And now Archer is also just here for some reason, despite him only appearing in FireRed and LeafGreen in the Sevi Islands, which isn't even in the Let's Go games. Look, these games were pretty weird. I guess these are also technically Pokemon Yellow remakes too, and not Red and Blue remakes, or even FireRed and LeafGreen remakes for that matter, because you are forced to get a single starter Pokemon that's on the cover of your game in Pikachu or Eevee, which can't even evolve. And much like in Yellow version, you can obtain the 3 Kanto starter Pokemon as gift Pokemon throughout the game by the time you get your 3rd gym badge, which is pretty cool. The Let's Go games also throw a lot of the Pokemon mechanics out of the window and take more of a Pokemon Go route. Let's Go has no abilities, the stat system is more like it was in Pokemon Go, and catching mechanics are like how they are in Pokemon Go as well, where you throw a Pokeball with your Joy-Con at wild Pokemon to catch them instead of battling them and weakening them first. This was a bit annoying as I prefer battling wild Pokemon and throwing a Pokeball by pressing an A button and not by doing this. Some people love it, some people hate it, but it is nice how you could avoid wild Pokemon in the overworld a bit easier without encountering something every few steps. These games were definitely targeted at the Gen 1ers and the Pokemon Go players who haven't played Pokemon in a while and give them that Generation 1 feel. Back in 2018, this was only 2 years after the release of Pokemon Go, which at launch only featured Gen 1 Pokemon. I know Pokemon Go has changed a lot since then, but back in 2018, Generation 1 was still a main focus in Pokemon Go, at least more so than it is now. And a quick editor's note here, I also wanted to add that in the Let's Go games, they feature Mega Pokemon for the Generation 1 Pokemon, most notably for the starters and for Mega Pidgeot, which your rival has. This was cool to incorporate a battle gimmick in the Let's Go games, but Let's Go is technically a Gen 7 game, and Gen 7's big battle gimmick was Z-moves, which aren't even in the Let's Go games at all. I guess Megas do make more sense for Kanto than Z-moves, especially since there's no held items in Let's Go games, and Gen 7 at least did feature Megas, although they kind of just brushed them to the side for a while, but this would set the stage for later Pokemon remake games where the main gimmick isn't even present. Some people might not include Let's Go as a traditional remake, and I see why you might think that, but if you were to include it alongside every other previous remake game, you'll notice how they all updated Pokemon to the modern hardware and changed other elements enough to warrant them feeling like a different game, unlike when we get to Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Pokemon fans have been asking for years for a Generation 4 remake, and despite countless YouTubers making videos about Gen 4 remakes leaks coming out, as far back as the 3DS era of Pokemon, we would finally see that in 2021 for the Nintendo Switch with Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. These games released 15 years after Diamond and Pearl's initial Japanese release, which is the longest period of time between a game release and a remake release, unless you count Let's Go in there compared to Yellow version, but that's a different story. And Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are remake games, alright. I want to preface this by saying I am a huge Generation 3 and Generation 4 Pokemon nerd, which is a huge focus on my channel, and I do like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. But wait, don't get out your pitchforks and click off the video yet. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl do have more than their fair share of flaws we'll discuss in this video. Unlike previous Pokemon remake games which upgrade the mechanics, the changes from Generation 4 to Generation 8 when BDSP released weren't as big as the changes from, say, the first 3 remake games had. Then the 4th remake game in the Let's Go games just went with Pokemon Go mechanics. BDSP basically have the same mechanics as the original Diamond and Pearl games, so they didn't really need a remake in that regard, and were mostly just remade for accessibility so more people could experience the Sinnoh region. The game is essentially a one-to-one remake from the originals, even trying to mimic the overworld art style the best they can with this chibi art style, which was a rather mixed bag among fans. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl don't exactly tie in with a Generation 8 counterpart, in this case Pokemon Sword and Shield, at all, really. If we look back at Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, they tie in beautifully with X and Y, incorporating Mega Evolution and adding in their own new ones even. Sword and Shield introduced Dynamaxing and Gigantamaxing, which is similar to Mega Evolution, then BDSP just ignores that entirely and doesn't even let you transfer over any Pokemon released post-Generation 4 to them, even in the post-game, let alone catch any. Every other previous remake game lets you obtain newer Pokemon one way or another, with an asterisk on the Let's Go games because they had Alolan forms and then the Mega Pokemon randomly, which are sort of new Pokemon but not really new Pokemon as they have the same dex number as the other Pokemon that exist already, but you get my point. Why didn't they go the Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire route and incorporate Dynamaxing in the main story somehow? They could have altered the Team Plasma story to fit in with it and have, like, I don't know, an Eternamax-like form for Giratina that was locked in the Distortion World, but they just didn't do that. That would also require them to implement the Distortion World and the Platinum changes as a whole, but they just didn't do that for Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Now, Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire didn't do this for Emerald either, but to Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire's credit, it's essentially a different game, while BDSP is just Diamond and Pearl on the Switch. Having more of these Platinum changes, like having the Platinum decks and even the Platinum gym teams and gym pacing, would have been perfect, but they didn't do that. They even somehow found a way to butcher contests and make them this weird rhythm game, which I actually kind of liked, I won't lie, but why even bother changing that? They did at least add the Grand Underground, which lets you catch a wider range of Pokemon, which was pretty cool, but overall I just think that since BDSP were outsourced and were made by Ilka, not made by Game Freak, they tried to play it too safe and just remade Diamond and Pearl one-to-one, rather than enhancing like we saw with ORAS, HGSS, or FRLG before it. Shiny hunting is kind of nice in BDSP though, I do like the radar, but overall I see why a lot of people were disappointed by Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl as remake games. And then, does Legends Arceus count as a remake? I'm gonna say no, but sometimes people consider them to be remake games as they are based off the Sinnoh region and the Sinnoh lore, but have a completely different story and even different gameplay to consider them even remakes in my opinion. So that's Remake Pokemon games. They started off as a way to modernize and upgrade Pokemon, turned into a way to essentially make them feel like new games they did with Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, then just essentially being ports to newer hardware like we saw with Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. They all have their own place and reason for existing, but to answer the question of what happened to Pokemon remake games, the idea of a remake just got less and less necessary as Pokemon evolved to what it is today, and moved on to a point where we essentially just need new ports to allow newer fans to experience these older original games. A modern Pokemon fan who only has a Nintendo Switch can still experience a lot of Pokemon. They just miss out on, I don't know, Generation 2, 3, 5, and 7, and sort of Generation 6, we'll see how Legends ZA goes. That's actually a lot more than I originally thought before I wrote this part down, but maybe the Switch 2 will be backwards compatible so you can play your original Pokemon Switch games on it, and maybe they can finally port over older games, rather than making them remakes and charging a premium for them like they did with Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. I think many Pokemon fans would prefer what they did with the 3DS Virtual Console releasing Generation 1 and Generation 2 on them for a fraction of the price of a brand new title, but we'll see. Anyway, that's enough rambling for now. If you do want to hear me ramble more though, consider subscribing and also leave a like to support the channel if you want to. If you want to hear even more rambling, follow me on Twitch linked below as well, where I'll be streaming some shiny hunting on mostly the older Pokemon games, with the highlights and other shiny Pokemon related content being put up on my extra channel, also linked in the description. And with all that out of the way, thank you guys so much for watching, have a great rest of your day, I'll see y'all next time, and bye bye!